Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Building Power. I am your host, Zakiya Jabbar. And this week we are excited to have Dr. Donna Ford. And so Dr. Ford is a distinguished professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at Ohio State University. She is also a faculty affiliate with the Kirwan Institute. Professor Ford is in the Department of Educational Studies, the Special Education Program. She was at Vanderbilt University for 15 years and held 2 endowed chairs there. Dr. Ford was a professor of special education at The Ohio State, an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Virginia, and an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky. Professor Ford conducts research primarily in gifted education and culturally responsive, multicultural, and urban education. Specifically, her work focuses on the achievement gap, right? Recruiting and retaining culturally different students in gifted education, multicultural curriculum and instruction, culturally competent teacher training and development, and African American identity, African American family education under representation and advanced placement. Wow, Dr. Ford, welcome to Building Power, Grassroots Education Advocacy. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing well, and I'm doing pretty good now that I have this opportunity to talk to you. And yes, correct, hashtag building power. Very pleased to be here.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So I
Hope
have
you're
to
doing
share.
well too.
That's right. I have to share with the audience. I was really excited to talk to you because so much of the education debate, particularly as it relates to Black children, seems to focus on perceived deficiencies. And I say perceived because a lot of this stuff is political, right? And then I read your article that was published, I believe back in February, as an interview in the Ohio State University News. And you talked about how public schools fail to recognize Black prodigies. And that really resonated with me. And I was like, you know what? I have to reach out to Dr. Ford. I want to talk about Black genius, Black prodigies, and how the system, the same system that tells us there's an achievement gap, oftentimes actually fails to recognize Black genius and Black prodigies. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work in gifted education and some of the failures that you see in terms of how public schools view Black students?
Well, thank you. And you said a lot that we definitely need to unpack. So let's spend some time doing that. Well,
Yes,
I've been in
ma'am.
the field for a little over, so basically 30 years. And I would like to say that my goal is to desegregate and integrate gifted education. So we have a crisis, and actually I want to correct that. And this is not an understatement. It's a pandemic. I think it's a worldwide issue where we have Black students more than any other racial and ethnic group being under-identified as gifted, having their potential not being recognized, and having their gifts and talents truly squandered. And that is not an overstatement. And so let me just share some data to support this claim. And then I do want to say something about the gap, okay? So Black students represent approximately 19% of our public schools here in the US. However, they represent only 10% of gifted education. We're talking about almost a 50% discrepancy. And that is just significant. This is yearly. The Office for Civil Rights, I'm using their data. So ocrdata.ed.gov. And when we quantify it, when we put a number to those percentages, we're talking about I believe it is over 250,000 Black students not being identified as gifted because they've been under-referred by educators. So that's teachers, administrative counselors, and others. So I just want to say, and I'm glad you brought this up, my work falls under this large issue of the achievement gap. And I do believe that the underrepresentation of Black students in gifted programs contributes to this Black-white achievement gap. Sometimes I call it an achievement trap. Sometimes I
Amen.
call it an oasis. And it is both intentional and it is unintentional. It is implicit bias and it is explicit bias. And let's just call it what it is. Too often, it is anti-Blackness. It's
That's it.
racism.
I mean, plain and simple. Absolutely. I
I
want to
don't
share
miss my
just
words because too much is at stake. And
you can't.
I just can't. I have to sleep. I sleep well at night. My conscience is clean because I call it out and I can back up what the hell I'm saying.
Oh,
So
I'm sure.
there you go.
Absolutely.
For
You
anybody
you
who,
were Amen. Listen, you were very clear, and you specifically identified even teacher demographic being a huge issue. And I would love for you to dig into that because, as you know, or as I'm sure you know, but just so for the audience purposes, most teachers in this country, in our school system, especially public schools, are white women. Vastly majority of are white women, so they're not seeing the genius. And this also makes me think about Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu's work, where the educators themselves will look at a Black boy or Black girl and say, you know, that behavior that they may be exhibiting is because, you know, they're just inherently horrible kids or they're just inherently bad, instead of seeing a disruptive behavior pattern being exhibited because the child is not being pushed, the child is bored, right? The child is not enjoying, right? Like there's never any self-reflection on the educator's part. Can you talk a little bit about that as well, this educator bias?
well, there's definitely too much, not just too little, I'm sorry, self-reflection. There's too much finger pointing. So it is always too often blaming others. So again, to put some numbers to this or percentages, it varies by a couple of percent each year, but about 75% of teachers are white females. So there can be a gender clash, especially with our Black males, our Black boys. There's also a cultural clash with our Black males and females. This cultural clash contributes to deficit thinking. It contributes to being blinded by stereotypes that have programmed educators, like all others, to 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 believe that there's things wrong with us rather than what's right. So I have this hashtag, and instead of it just saying African Americans, it says African American can't, as if we can't do anything. And that's another presentation, another talk on special education, as well as unjust, inequitable discipline. So being blinded by deficit thinking, educators are not referring our Black students to gifted programs. And let me be more specific. Our predominantly white teachers who are females are not referring us to gifted programs for screening, identification, and assessment. So it's a pandemic. I mean, I rarely have been invited to go to a school district where Black students were equitably represented in gifted education. And I've done state by state analysis for journals, and no matter what the state is, underrepresentation exists. It is unjust, it is intentional, and it is unintentional. So we must definitely diversify the teaching force, more Black teachers, more Hispanic teachers, and we must provide anti-racist culturally responsive training in professional development as well as in higher education, so that we can go from this deficit thinking to what I call dynamic thinking. So let me just summarize it and say, with deficit thinking, it is the less we know about Black students, the more we make up. With dynamic thinking, it would be the reverse. The more we know about Black students, the less we make up. And I am determined to do my part to make sure that educators get this training at all levels
Absolutely.
and in all settings.
Absolutely. I'm honored to have you here, and I'm excited that we get to talk about the brilliance of Black students. So I'm not going to shoot all the questions in my mind to you right now, but one question I have, because I've heard of other speakers talk about this: gifted education came to be in what year? And was it post-Brown education? Was gifted education, so in other words, was gifted education, special education, and all these new forms of the way that we recognize abilities or disabilities in students, was this a new way to segregate students after Brown, or did gifted education exist before Brown?
For the most, so I'm not really good in history. It was not my favorite subject in school, no less now. But I am mindful that if we, as the saying goes, don't study it, we are doomed to repeat it. But I don't think that it's an accident that just when 1954 we had Brown versus the Board of Education desegregating our schools, that we also had more gifted programs coming into existence. And
Right.
yes, it is my belief that it was a new way. It not was and is still a contemporary way to have segregation. So I and others have said we have private schools, meaning gifted programs, within public schools. And you
Yep.
rarely to this day see Black students sitting next to white students in gifted programs and advanced placement classes. It's rare. And that's why I said it is a tragedy and it is a pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this subject really sits well with me because I, have experienced this with my own son. My daughter, unfortunately, she was just entering school when the pandemic hit with COVID here. So we, weren't able to really see what her experience would be like. But before my son, and I'm going to ask you the gender breakdown of the Black kids who do make it, I would surmise there's probably more Black girls than there are Black boys who are making it into gifted education, because some of the data that I've seen, and even the data that came out at the end of the Obama administration, you may remember his administration issued guidance for the overrepresentation of Black children in special ed programs, particularly for behavioral type reasons. So the obsessive defiant disorder, that stuff. Like, you can go to any school and you can see a room full of Black boys who have that identity instead of them actually being tested for gifted. And some people have seen, some educators, as you probably know, have pushed to have, and the parents, like me, have pushed to have children not in special ed, but actually have to force the school system to test them for gifted. And come to find out, on many occasions, those children have been wrongfully labeled for special education because of educator bias, and should have actually been referred to gifted, to be pushed more, to have more creativity. Yes, jump in on that.
Well, as Carter G. Woodson said, the miseducation of the Negro is still exists today. And we see that, yes, with our being invisible, almost invisible in gifted education, gifted and talented education. And we see it with the overrepresentation in special education as well as discipline. And I want to say all of this is just so much teacher discretion oriented. It's so subjective. So this is where we have culturally assaultive education. this deficit thinking where the behavior of a Black boy is misinterpreted and adultified, for example, for doing one thing, and then a white boy, same age, does it and is given a slap on the risk, if that. Now, I want to say this. I want listeners to know this, viewers to know this. Let's be clear about special education. It is not just overrepresentation, say overall. It is in what's called high incidence areas and those that are riddled with stereotypes and biases. So this would be emotional and behavioral disorders. And that is where many of us are housed, and it is definitely racism. And it would be in intellectual disabilities, formerly called MR, and I can't bring myself to use, the term. And it would be also in areas like ADHD, sometimes autism, now, and learning disabilities. But the problem is, and developmental delay. So that's where children are young. And this is where they just like in a holding cell, school prison pipeline, waiting to get mislabeled, misidentified, miseducated. And it definitely fuels the achievement gaps, traps, gulfs. And there's just no question about it. So yes, I know our focus mainly right now is on education, but there's no way I can ignore the other areas where we are 2 to 3 times, especially our Black boys, overrepresented for discipline and for high incidence special education.
That's right. That's right. That's been my experience. And how I even got into advocacy work was having to push back on white women teachers, who wanted to, obviously have no expertise. They're teachers, so they're not counselors, therapists, social workers. They're none of that. But a lot of times what I have seen and experienced firsthand, not just with myself, but with other Black parents that I've organized with over the years, is teachers are actually diagnosing children and telling parents
Which is illegal. Teachers not diagnose your child. They can describe what the characteristics are and concerns that they have, but they are not allowed to diagnose. I want to say something that that may be implicit, to some, but I want to make it explicit. You are a professional. I am a professional. And regardless of our educational level, our income, our zip code, we are still deemed, wrongfully so, genetically, culturally, and socially inferior. So you have to fight for your child with your credentials. So imagine those who are the working poor, these essential workers that we're talking about with COVID. Imagine those who are in homeless situations. Imagine those who are just waiting for this $1,400 check, who live in paycheck to paycheck, or who are unemployed, who don't have an advanced degree or any degree.
Right.
So if you are facing these barriers, then it is, just imagine what those who have less are facing. And this must be exposed, interrogated, and talked about. I had problems getting my own son identified as gifted in hell. I got a PhD, and I was working on one. And I had to fight. No less some of my colleagues in the field as well, who are equally, credentialed in terms of education. So we have people who are well known in the field of gifted education, who write more than others in the field of gifted education, having problems getting our own children identified. It is very problematic. And I don't want that to go unnoticed. So there has been one major study, and it was done in 2016, and it showed, to be repetitive, that even when we have the same credentials, same test scores, same grades, same family background other than race, like educational level, teachers still under-refer us. And when I say us, I mean primarily Blacks and then secondarily Hispanics. So racial injustices cannot be
It's
denied.
anti-blackness, right? It's anti-blackness because I don't think you see that across the board
Mm-mm.
um, with other students of color. I know you study this, so definitely correct me if I'm wrong. I know that other students of color are, well, let me just talk about it just straightforward, right? I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Montgomery County schools for years have been thought to be one of the best school districts in the country, not just in the state of Maryland, but in the country. And there are families who have actually filed lawsuits against the school district, and they're Asian American families. This is true. I'm not making, but there are Asian American families who have filed lawsuit against the school district for trying to make the gifted education program more equitable, to ensure that Black and Brown students are being referred. Black and Brown students are being included in that, and certainly we've had white families but here particularly here in Montgomery County, Maryland, the Asian American families have filed lawsuit. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP Parent Council here in Montgomery County have been meeting to figure out, like, how do we handle this, right?
Yeah.
Because this is like people of color, not necessarily white people this time. And so, like, how do we have this conversation to say, this isn't about like taking away seats from your families. This is about expanding the pie to make sure that
Yeah.
all children have access. And then there's another argument, and I tend to lean on this side because this is the United States of America and we have enough money to spend for wars and other things, that all education should be at the level of gifted, and all children, right, no matter what their cultural background or their family socioeconomic status, should have access to a high quality education, period.
Well, so let me come back to that point, and please remind me. But I definitely want to say what a shame and disgrace it is that we have to become litigious. We have to, file lawsuits and complaints in order to have our children experience an equitable and just education. Not in just in for 1954, but we're talking about 2021. So that's and some families don't have the wherewithal, the capital to do that. So, but we must. I mean, as families, you are your child's first and forever advocate. So you do what is necessary to help break down barriers and hold professionals accountable. And your second point was, I said, remind me, and then I can't remember what it was.
That all children, there's an
Oh,
argument that we should just get rid of these ways to separate children in our schools, and that why can't all children have access to what's deemed gifted education, right? Like, gifted education should be accessible to the entire body, instead of looking at ways to segregate children, especially since we know that gifted education and special education popped up after the Brown decision.
well, so we really do need to have services for gifted students. And no, not all children are gifted. All children have some strengths, have strengths, but not all children are gifted. Like, not all children need special education services. When it comes to rigor should be not, so I use this phrase, so rigor, not rigor mortis, is what our children need. We need rigor and we need relevance. And yes, that is what we have, about 16,000 school districts, and we need this in all of those school districts and all of those school buildings. So we need to have levels of services and opportunities so that students can have their needs met. One example would be there are some children who need to be grade skipped, not all. And so that needs to be available. There are some who need subject acceleration. Their strength is math, or their strength is language arts. That's not for all children, but most, I want everybody to hear me, most teachers have no training in gifted education. And I
Wow.
mean, none. And so they don't know what they're doing. And so you have these privileged white parents fighting like hell to get their children in gifted programs. And for what? All they do is get more spelling words. That's not rigor. So teachers need to have this training, and families need to understand what you're fighting for. Yeah, you get in a segregated school system or building, but you may not be getting rigor. I may not be clear on this. Rigor is for everyone,
Okay.
and that, at every child's level. And so, yes, I believe in tailoring education to children's needs, so we will not have miseducation,
As
denied
far as
opportunity.
Right. We haven't talked about this, but I know that my experience here in the school system, like I said, here in Maryland, the way that gifted identification is made is certainly the teacher has input, but students also have to take a test. Do you have any thoughts on what should be sort of the rubric, if you will, to identify students for gifted education? What is, sort of from your research, what is best practices, if you will, for how to identify gifted education?
Okay, so I try to, when I'm working with each school, definitely be mindful of their context and what their needs are. So some recommendations I would make for one school, I might not make for another. But
Okay.
this is hands down, this is non-negotiable. We must heavily scrutinize the test that is chosen. And if we find out that there are different test scores across racial lines, then that test should not be used, and or modifications need to be made. Just period. This obsession with test scores for was high stakes testing, but this obsession must be addressed. It in addition to teachers not making referrals, the next roadblock for gifted education, the next barrier is the test. So there's a lot of fighting about, oh, what test should we use? Well, it's not just, and I believe in test bias, and I've written about this and several of my other colleagues as well. So, we need to make sure that we have a test that is mainly nonverbal, and that means it's reduced in cultural loading and reduced in linguistic loading. And cultural loading means white culture. All right.
That's the
Items that
center. That's the
favor,
standard. Right.
yeah, items that favor them. And then we have, language. And, nobody's really talking about Black English. When they think about languages accommodations, it's usually for, English language learners. No one test should be made used to make a decision. And I'm going to borrow from one of my colleagues, James Moore, Dr. James Moore III at OSU. And he talks about more than many people that I know. He talks about educational malpractice. So to make a decision about whether a child is gifted or not requires special education service or not, based on one test, is educational malpractice, in his opinion, mine, and others. So, but yes, we need to look at intelligence, but the tests we use matters. The policies and procedures matter. The cutoff scores matter. Whether we use universal screening or not matters. Whether we have building norms or not matters. I know on and on and on. I'm just want listeners, viewers to be mindful of what to look out for. So it's just not, you're going to find this magic test and everything is going to be okay. No, it's not. When you examine and when you choose the test, there is bias. When you interpret the results, there is bias. And so that professional training is essential. We need to have measures of creativity. not subjective like a teacher checklist, but more objective. Many of our children are very, very creative, and Paul Torrance found this out decades ago. We need to look at leadership. If you look at the characteristics of a leader, they are charismatic, right? They tend to be extroverted, people oriented. They are very persuasive and more. Well, gang leaders have those same characteristics, but nobody is channeling, those types of gifts and talents into, activities and behaviors that are more acceptable and positive and productive. So we must stop being obsessed with these test scores and add other measures, multiple measures, get input from many sources, and then we will do much better. And we're already rock bottom with what's happening. We have no place but to go up and be accountable, be equitable.
Right. Accountable and equitable. Yeah, definitely appreciate that. And I actually appreciate how you say you provide tailored support. That is so important. And we don't talk about that, like the context of a community, the cultural, background of a particular community. I say that all the time, even in organizing and activism. Just because a particular campaign works well in Chicago doesn't mean it's going to work well in Oakland, right? And vice versa. Or it may not work well in rural Alabama. You can't take your Chicago ideas and just say, hey, we're going to make this work everywhere. That's just not how people are. Like, we're very complex. And certainly cultural differences exist because the histories of communities are so complex and nuanced. I feel like there's so many box checking, not just in education, but I can think about other fields as well. There's so many norms, like you said, that's like the norm is white or Eurocentric. And the majority of this country by 2050 or even sooner now, I believe, won't be white. Like, where this is going to be more people of color. And so that cultural difference really needs to be, I believe, like you mentioned, lifted up a lot more than just this, testing is the only way, instead of even, like you said, creativity or young people being able to produce a portfolio. No one talks about like the arts, like an amazing artist, a gifted artist, right? So it seems to me like there's so many things that could be used to identify certainly a child who is gifted and talented and should be on the track to prosperity. The one thing that is coming up for me now, Dr. Ford, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this and any kind of professional feedback you can give. What kind of consequences, if you will, like real material consequences, happen for Black families, who could have or should have been identified for gifted and talented, and then they graduate high school and they never had that designation? I imagine they probably lose out on thousands of scholarships. They lose out on free college. What are some real material consequences of not identifying a child who should have been?
Well, you definitely already identified a few of those, but I just want to start with underachievement. So when we talk about an achievement gap, we're comparing one group to another, their performance. And as you said, whites are almost always the norm. Now, let's get beyond that. We're talking about underachievement, and that is where a child is not reaching his or her potential, which is what I did my dissertation on, and which is what I study as well. So we're talking about these gifts and talents atrophying. And I mean, I gave an example with our leaders, if they happen to be gay leaders. It's used in socially unacceptable ways, and we missed great opportunities for them to become, the next president, like, Obama, or like our Vice President Harris and more. Those are real, that's tangible. We have students who And I did a recent presentation at this at OSU, and I'm so happy, that my dean is supportive and wants this, out in the open. But I did a presentation on how this underrepresentation contributes to underachievement, denied opportunities, and decreased opportunities to get into college, to get the test score and the grades, to be able to, also have a resume that looks impressive and gets them into not just a college, but our more elite colleges. So there's this negative pipeline. Now, from a philosophical perspective, but I think it's still very real. I grew up believing in the United Negro College Fund saying, "And mind is a terrible thing to waste." And as people have seen me say in presentations, a mind is a terrible thing to erase. And I get pissed off just saying that quote, just, flipping that to be even more direct about what is happening. So that phrase, squandering gifts and talents, is real, and denied opportunity. So, I mean, we want to keep being philosophical. Let's talk about a dream deferred. Langston Hughes, that's what's happening. Not just dreams deferred, but dreams damn denied. And it takes a toll on our community. And I want other people to know, not just the child, not just the family, not just the community, but the larger society. They lose too. You lose when you don't identify our Black students as being highly capable and having high potential. You lose out. So we got to start early. And to look in those 5 areas that are mentioned in the federal definitions of gifted, and make sure that we are doing right by children.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a couple of commenters. One of the commenters, Mr. Conrad, mentioned the Torrance Test, I guess, that identifies creative thinking. Do you have any thoughts on any particular test like that he has named that you think is more in line with identifying as far as an assessment that would identify gifted and talented?
Yeah, I mentioned E. Paul Torrance earlier, and I also said that our checklist for creativity, for any of the areas of giftedness, they're subjective. However, they're objective ones. And my preferred one for creativity is the Torrance Test of creative thinking. He's passed, but I consider him, and so do others, the father of creativity, especially through a cultural lens and an economic lens, and
Wow.
The richness. So if we look at it through also a cultural lens, when we talk
Sure.
about Boykin's work, A. Wade Boykin, on Afrocentric cultural styles, he talks about expressive individualism, creativity. And so we know how to make a way out of no way. And people use the word resourceful. Okay, you can say that, but I'm saying it's even more than that. I prefer to say
Sure.
creative, visionary. We walk to the beat of a different drummer. We like to be different. I mean, I got to use myself as an example. You can't see it now, but my hair is blue, and I did it on purpose. I like being different. You know, this right here, look, this is a headband around my neck. A headband. It should be on my head, but it's around my neck because I like being different. And I can go into more examples. So I consider myself one who is not trying to be like everyone else and thinks outside the box. And those are just like a few. So I'm saying you don't need an intelligence test. You can use an objective creativity test. And I just thought about this. When our Black children, for the most part, are identified as gifted, it is in creativity, not intellectual, which is problematic, not specific academic, but it is in creativity. But yet people don't value that. In
Right.
Bloom's taxonomy. It's taxonomy of critical and critical thinking. In 2004, I believe it was, the 6 levels of critical and creative thinking flipped. I mean, one of the 6 levels. The highest used to be called evaluation or evaluating, and now is synthesis/creating. So I love this quote. I think it was by Robert Sternberg, who said, if you give an intellectually gifted child a problem, they will solve it. Creatively gifted individuals find a problem to be solved. We are creative. Now I'm getting hyped up. I didn't say hyper, I said hyped up. We are creative. We are innovative. We are visionary. We think outside the box. We're also intelligent. We're also outstanding in the visual and performing arts. I mean, think about Beyonce recently, right? Setting, records. But we can do more than sing and dance. We can think.
Right.
We can think. And that needs to be recognized. And we can lead. And all of that needs to be nurtured. So don't settle for complacency. Don't settle for little. And by the way, people call me angry. You know what I am. You don't tell me I'm angry. Hell, I know I am. I'm being real now. So you about to hear from Donna from Cleveland. That's what I call myself when I'm about to change.
Right.
Get angry. Get upset. Get pissed off. I don't care what word you want to use, and use it for good.
Yes,
Who can we think about? Right? Our late senator. All right. Use it for good trouble. Hell, sometimes it takes some bad trouble, but anyway, effect change. Just don't go to jail.
Right.
I ain't trying to go to
Right.
jail, but I'm going to fight. I'm going to own my anger. You can call me hashtag angry Black scholar. I flip that narrative. I own it. And you can call me outraged and righteous indignation, righteous pissivity. All right.
Yes.
Stop.
Yeah. No, that's it. I mean, I think you're getting a lot of amens in the comments, certainly. And you're right. I also own that. I mean, I hear people get upset with the whole angry Black woman trope. We have a right to be angry with everything that's happening, but I was so inspired listening to you, and the names were popping up in my head when you said we are visionary, we are creative, we are intelligent, and I just started thinking, and I'm like, who could have done what Harriet Tubman did, right? She had to be intelligent to be able to outmaneuver all of these people who came after her. And she did it on more than one occasion. She did it over a dozen times, taking people to freedom. Not only did she have to outmaneuver, the institution, like, the white institution and the slave catchers, but she had to be creative even with Black folk. Who would tell? Think about
and look at Georgia and Stacey Abrams, right?
Yeah.
I mean, our contemporary one, and she's not the only one. Right. Yeah, and they're just so. I'm looking at some of the comments. Thank you all. There are just so many of us, and okay, myself, and yeah, I'm gonna drop names. James L. Moore III at OSU, Eric Hines, Joy Lawson Davis, Tarek Grantham, Coleman Whiting, Christina Collins, Ken Dixon, and there are a few more of us. We are fighting, and you know what? We're fighting the Negro pens too.
Yeah, that's why I said, that's why I brought up Harriet Tubman. Like, she had to figure out how to even be creativity, even with Black people who, they're in internalized oppression, the fear, of like, you crazy, you shouldn't be trying to run away. You know what I mean? So that level of creativity. Then I think about certainly, the Black women who helped the United States get to the moon, right? They grew up in so-called, deficient
Yeah.
segregated schools. They didn't have the same, but look at how they were still. How many of our people did wonderful, great inventions even before the Brown decision? Like we were so called in deficient, schools. But one of the things and I have a problem with that narrative because I think about like all the amazing things that we have had to do in most oppressive conditions. And for people
Right.
to
And
say,
we don't get credit for it. I'm
right,
sorry I had to interrupt you, but we don't get
yeah, we don't get
credit
credit in the
for
most
it.
oppressive
And you know
conditions.
what? We don't have to keep waiting for other people to give us credit. Learn how to pat yourself on the damn back. And I don't mean
Right.
ego tripping, but because we've made a way, as the saying goes, out of no way.
Out
Our
of
zip
nowhere.
code is not our destiny. I'm from East
Amen.
Cleveland and Cleveland. My zip code is not my destiny. And I defied every stereotype that there is because I have agency. I believe in myself. And with that, for those listeners who are parents, who are caregivers, um, we need to make sure we promote racial pride in our children. And as I posted on Facebook and many other places, when you love the skin you're in, you can brush off all this hate, be it,
Yeah.
due to racism or be it due to colorism. And by the way, we're
Yeah.
not going to get sidetracked. Yes, we have what are called Negro pens, and there are not a lot of them, but we have more who are called racists. And that is what we need to stay focused on both. But I am not going to deny that some people who look like skin folk, as the saying goes, can trip us up. So you're using Harriet Tubman right on point. Speak
Yep.
up. Don't be
Right.
silent. Don't be complicit.
Right. Carter G.
Your
Woodson
child
told us
has
about
one
that, though.
time. I'm sorry, your child has one time to be a child, one time to go through, so to speak, preschool to grade 12. You better be their biggest fan.
That's
Be their
right.
biggest fan. And I and the other names that I listed, we are here for you in terms of desegregating and integrating gifted education.
That's amazing. Can you tell people where, because I know we have to wrap here soon, as you have another meeting to get to. This has been an honor, my honor, to have this conversation with you, Dr. Ford. And like I said, we've had great, comments. People are engaged across platforms. People are watching on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and people are very engaged. Can you tell people where they can find you on social media, or anything that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Well, you can find, I use my full name, Donna Y. Ford, and you can find me that way on Facebook. And it's the same for Twitter at Donna Y. Ford. And don't do much on Instagram. But the main thing is go to my website and contact me, www.drdonnayford.com. And again, somebody just put in there. Okay, so that's how you can contact me. And yes, you will see me venting and griping and kvetching, but you also see me with solutions, with
That's it.
recommendations.
That's
And
it.
I will work with you for empowerment, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
not
That's
give lip service to it. Not with lip service. I mean, really coming through with, as you said, concrete recommendations and solutions. So
yes.
we're
That's
going
what
to
we
talk
need.
because, we need to speak up and speak out, but we need to do also.
Yes, absolutely. Theory meeting practice, right? Like making sure like that we're making the theory actually work in people's lives and practical. Dr. Ford, this has again been an honor to have you. We have put the article as well in the comments for people to go and read that. Again, that inspired me to reach out so we could have this conversation because I get so tired of us talking about deficiencies and unfortunately, I think we don't realize that when we talk about what Black children aren't doing compared to white children, I think about, educators like Asa Hilliard and all the other strong African-centered educators like, well, who made them the standard? Who said that we should be compared to them in the first place, right? So This
Yeah,
has been great.
yeah, let's continue this, please. And
Yes,
what I mean by
definitely.
that is we can continue to talk about gifted education and be more specific with me answering these questions. But I want us to also talk about special education, which,
Yes,
as I've said before, if special education was so special, more white people will be fighting to get into it. There's, it's problematic. And
absolutely.
about our school counselors, and I know a few of them are on here. I mentioned Dr. Moore, I mentioned Dr. Hines. There are others. We need to talk about career academies. My colleague at Ohio State University, Edward Fletcher, we finally call him Eddie, and more. So what I want to say is there are more people out there than some of us to arm ourselves in order to do what's right. By the way, I'm sorry, one more thing. You got to reach out, and he has a book called The Brilliance of Black Boys, to Brian L. Wright at the University of Memphis.
Okay.
I often feel, years ago, felt lonely in this field of gifted education, like our children do, but we're not alone. And we need to talk about discipline with J. Luke Wood. Man, I could just go on, my dear, but I'm
Oh
just
yeah, yeah.
saying
J. Luke Wood is
there
amazing.
are
Yeah, I'm
people
familiar, very
out
familiar with
here.
him. I would love if you can,
Yes.
if you would, yeah, send an email introduction to the brother. You said the University of Memphis. What's his name, Brian? If you could
hmm
connect us, I would
Brian
love to have
L.
him
Wright.
on the program. Yes, I would love to have him on.
I
That would be
certainly will.
great.
This is not going to be our first and last conversation. I'm inviting myself
Oh,
back.
that's right. That's right. You are more than welcome to come back. And
I'm
you're right.
inviting
We do
myself.
need to talk about special education. I actually do. I may even have a panel discussion on that because we do need to talk about special education. I loved how you said it. You said if special education was so special, white parents would be fighting to get their kids in. But
They will.
we know what that's all about. Thank you, Dr. Ford. This has been great. We will see everybody next week, same place, same time here at noon Eastern every Wednesday. Take care, everyone.